Okay, everyone, here we are for the third and final part of the video lecture for Chapter 20. So, in this video lecture, part 3, rather, we're going to focus on ultimately the fate of primary production in an ecosystem, what happens to it ultimately. Okay. Now, we've talked about net primary productivity already. That's the energy available to heterotrophs in an ecosystem. Heterotrophs, again, are those organisms that feed on other organisms. So think about herbivores, for example, or the carnivores that feed on the herbivores. Okay, remember also what net primary productivity is. Net primary productivity is gross primary productivity minus respiration. So phytoplankton, for example, in a lake, they are carrying out photosynthesis, the amount of carbon converted from inorganic form to organic, CO2 to sugar, essentially, is gross primary production. That energy is. Then remember that those phytoplankton have to break those sugars down through respiration to use that energy for maintenance and that sort of thing. And so, what energy then is left after respiration is net primary production. That's what is then available to other levels of consumers within the food webs, right? Okay, so when we talk about the ultimate fate of net primary production, that's certainly one important question, right? What is the fate of net primary production in any ecosystem? But secondly, we can ask, how is it that net primary production can move to other ecosystems? Okay, and if we're talking about net primary production moving from one trophic level to the next or from one ecosystem to the next, ultimately we're talking about energy moving from one trophic level to the next or from one ecosystem to another. All right. So, herbivores or detritivores eventually consume almost all primary production. So, we've talked about herbivores. Everybody should know what an herbivore is. But what is a detritivore? A detritivore is an organism that feeds on detritus. So, think about plant production, plant biomass, let's say, that's not eaten directly by an herbivore. That plant eventually dies, and then the breakdown of that dead organic material, that plant dead biomass, is carried out by detritivores. All right. Okay. So herbivores and detritivores eventually consume almost all primary productivity, which is plant biomass. Now, what happens to the energy when it's consumed by herbivores and detritivores? Well, some passes from the body as waste. So think about feces and urine, right? There's energy in both of those. That's energy that was never assimilated by the body for use in respiration, growth and development, that sort of thing. Now, some of the energy that's consumed as food is actually assimilated. So this is really referring to energy that is absorbed across the digestive tract wall, okay, ends up in the bloodstream and can be used by the cells. So this energy then is assimilated, can be used for metabolism. It can be used for heat production. Think about endothermic organisms like ourselves. We use a good bit of the energy in our food for heat production to help us maintain a relatively constant body temperature. All right. Some of the energy can be used for maintenance. So this means acquiring more food. So supporting, hunting activity, that kind of thing. Performing work such as muscle contraction, repairing tissue damage, all these sorts of things, okay, are considered maintenance. So of the energy that's assimilated, some's used for metabolism and heat production, other of it is used for maintenance. All right. But that's not all of the energy that was assimilated. Okay, there's still some amount left over, and that remaining energy that's not used for metabolism and heat production or for maintenance can be used for production of new herbivore tissue, let's say. Okay. All right, so growth of new tissues, production of young, so reproduction, obviously. That development or growth of new tissue or production of young is referred to as secondary production. Okay, secondary production, or secondary productivity sometimes as it's called. This is the net energy allocated to production. So it's usually a fairly small fraction of the total amount of energy in food that was assimilated. In other words, that was absorbed across the digestive tract wall. Okay, so secondary production then is the formation of living, for example, living heterotroph biomass over a period of time. We can measure it as grams per unit area per unit time, for example. Okay, this is the heterotroph equivalent of autotroph net primary productivity. So when autotrophs carry out gross primary productivity, you subtract out of that the amount that they're allocating toward respiration, and what you have left is net primary productivity. That is analogous to secondary productivity in herbivores and higher level consumers. Okay, secondary production is going to be greatest when the birth rate of the population and the growth rate of individuals are the highest. That should tell you that secondary production is what provides or represents the energy that's essentially converted into population growth and the growth of individuals. Okay. Now, secondary production obviously depends on primary production, because primary production is essentially autotrophs in an ecosystem capturing sunlight and then funneling it through the various trophic levels of the ecosystem. So secondary production depends on primary production, right? Primary productivity, therefore, should function as a constraint on the amount of secondary productivity within any given ecosystem. There was a meta-analysis of 69 studies reporting net primary production and secondary production for a range of terrestrial ecosystems. And from this meta-analysis, which is sort of a summary analysis of a lot of other studies, a number of different patterns were found. Okay, first, as primary productivity increased, herbivore biomass and consumption of primary productivity by those herbivores also increased. And that's what you see here. Oops, sorry. See if I can get that to go away. All right, won't go away. All right. So what we see here is net primary productivity. So this is in kilojoules of energy per square meter per year. So it is a rate. All right. And here we have herbivore biomass in terms of kilojoules per meter squared. This is not a rate because there's no time element there. Okay. This is just showing you the standing biomass at any given moment. All right. What you see is that as net primary productivity goes up, so does the standing crop herbivore biomass. Okay, so that's suggesting obviously there's a relationship between essentially secondary production as measured by herbivore biomass and primary production or net primary production. And that makes sense because this represents the amount of energy coming into the system that can then be allocated toward herbivore growth. All right, here we have another way to look at this. Again, we have net primary productivity on the x-axis, and here we have herbivore consumption. So how much food or energy as food herbivores are consuming. And we see that as net primary production increases, we have an increase in consumption, and that makes perfect sense, okay? Again, this is just showing us that there's a relationship between the amount of energy coming into a system as net primary production and how much of that is being used for growth and development of the population, essentially. All right, so secondary productivity of herbivores also increased with primary productivity in this meta-analysis of these 69 studies. Here we see, again, net primary productivity on the x-axis. Now we see herbivore secondary productivity. So whereas the previous slide showed us the standing crop of herbivore biomass, how much biomass was accounted for by herbivores at a given instant, this is showing the rate at which the herbivore biomass is growing over some time frame. In this case, kilojoules per meter square per year. And so what we're seeing here is net primary productivity and consequent increase in secondary productivity as a result of that. And again, we see a fairly strong correlation there. All right. Okay, all of these are suggesting that primary production acts as a constraint on secondary production. Obviously, you can't have more secondary production than you do primary production because primary production is the only way that energy goes into the system and can then be used for secondary production. So this is basically terrestrial systems that we've seen for this meta-analysis for these graphs here, but similar relationships have been found between phytoplankton and zooplankton in lake ecosystems, for example. Phytoplankton, again, being the primary production source, and zooplankton being a measure of secondary production. Same thing there. So what these studies then are suggesting is that there's bottom-up control of energy flow through ecosystems. In other words, the populations and productivity of autotrophs, those that are capturing sunlight through photosynthesis, control the populations and productivity of the heterotrophs. All right. This is why plants largely determine the animal populations that can live in a given ecosystem. Okay, now there's variation among consumer organisms in their efficiency of converting energy consumed into secondary production. Okay, different types of organisms, different species have different efficiencies of converting primary production into secondary production. So we can ask, how does this ability to convert energy to secondary production vary among these different consumer groups or organisms? Well, a couple of things to define here first. The food that's ingested by a consumer can be either assimilated in the gut, or it can be expelled from the body as waste. So again, food energy that's assimilated is energy that actually is transferred across the gut wall, okay, into the bloodstream. All right. Any food energy that remains in the food as it transits through the gut and does not get absorbed across the body wall, that becomes waste energy, and it's expelled from the body, typically as feces, but also as urine. Okay. The energy that is assimilated can be used in either respiration or it can be used for production. All right. So if we take a look here at this figure, I really wish I could get that. There it goes. All right. Take a look at this figure. So we have this caterpillar. It's feeding on a leaf, right? Well, let's assume that it has ingested 200 joules of plant material. Okay, that's what was ingested. All right. Sort of as a rule of thumb, especially with these kinds of herbivores, maybe 50% or 100 joules of that ingested energy is expelled directly as waste. So that goes out as feces for the most part. All right. Now, there's 100 joules then that would be assimilated. This is what's going to be absorbed across the gut wall. Okay. Now, about 40% or 40 joules of that is going to be assimilated energy that's used for production. So this is going to be growth of this organism. It could be, allocated toward reproduction. Could be allocated towards maintenance, tissue repair, muscle movement, all those sorts of things. Okay, 60% or 60 joules of the assimilated energy might be used for respiration. All right. So right off the bat, we see that only about 50% of the energy that's consumed as food is actually assimilated. Okay, so that means we can talk about what's called assimilation efficiency. Assimilation efficiency, go to the next slide. So assimilation efficiency, all right, is the ratio of the amount of energy assimilated to the amount that's actually ingested, all right? Now, that's a little bit different than production efficiency. Production efficiency measures how efficiently the assimilated energy is incorporated into secondary production, and that is the ratio of secondary production to the amount of energy assimilated. All right, so again, assimilation efficiency measures the efficiency of extracting energy from food. Okay, that's what this ratio tells us. And then production efficiency measures how efficiently the assimilated energy is incorporated into secondary production. All right. Okay, so in our example, go back for a second. In our example here with the caterpillar, right, we had 200 joules of plant material or energy from plant material ingested. Okay, we had 100 joules of that was assimilated. All right, we had of that 100 joules, we had 60 that was allocated toward respiration, and we had 40 that was allocated toward production. Right. That was 50%. The other 50% of the ingested was allocated toward waste. It was never actually assimilated. Okay. So in this case, what is the assimilation efficiency of this consumer? In other words, what is A divided by I? Right. Well, if assimilated is 100 joules, that's here, right? And ingested is 200, then that is 100 over 200, which equals 0.5 or 50%. That's our assimilation efficiency in this example. Okay. All right. So these assimilation efficiencies, as we've just done here for this caterpillar, they vary widely depending on the type of organism that or secondary consumer that we're talking about. Carnivores tend to be more efficient than herbivores. Okay. And this is one reason why herbivores, for the most part, seem to be constantly eating, right? Think about cows and other grazers, caterpillars, whatever. Their assimilation efficiencies are not that high. Carnivore assimilation efficiency is much higher, okay? And one reason for that is because, meat is easier to break down and digest than plant material. That's one of the primary reasons for that. Now, invertebrates have higher efficiencies generally than vertebrates do. Invertebrates tend to lose relatively little energy as respiratory heat. Invertebrates tend to be ectothermic organisms, meaning that of the energy they're assimilating, they allocate very little toward maintaining a constant internal temperature. Their body temperatures tend to fluctuate with the ambient air temperature or environmental temperature around them. And so they're not using a lot of their assimilated energy to heat production. Okay. So that means they have higher efficiencies. Now, within the vertebrates, okay, ectothermic vertebrates have intermediate production efficiency, and the endotherms have very low production efficiencies. So we're endotherms, for example, and we have very low production efficiencies, usually on the order of 1 to 2 or 1 to 3% of the assimilated energy is converted into production in the endothermic vertebrates. All right. So we have a table here that shows some of the general patterns here. So here we're seeing production efficiency, right? Of the amount of energy assimilated, how much is allocated toward production. Okay, so secondary production, growth of new tissue, growth of new organisms, reproduction, that sort of thing. In mice, maybe 4%, voles 2.6%, other mammals maybe about 3%, something like that. Look at birds, the lowest of the vertebrate groups. Part of the reason for this, it's thought, is that because birds have very high metabolic rates, which you need to provide energy for powered flight. Okay, it's very energy expensive to do that. And so birds have to maintain a high body temperature to keep up high reaction rates, especially in their muscles, to be able to carry out flight or powered flight. That means they have less energy available for reproduction. Also, if you've ever noticed, it usually takes two parents, both the female and the male, the mother and the father, to raise chicks in bird species, because those chicks require so much energy. They have to be fed constantly. And this is all basically indicating low production efficiency, which sort of can be traced back to the fact that they fly, and they have to produce so much muscle mass to support powered flight as a result. Okay. Now look at fish. Fish, as vertebrates go, have about the highest production efficiencies. Okay. They tend to be, for the most part, ectothermic, which means they're not, allocating a lot of the energy they're taking in the form of food toward maintaining body temperature, because they live in the water, and water has a very high heat capacity, so it draws heat out of the body very rapidly. It's difficult to fight against that, so they just don't, for the most part. Look at social insects. They have, as insects go, relatively low efficiencies. Look at some of the others, like Orthoptera. These are crickets, grasshoppers, that kind of thing, about some of the highest efficiencies that you have. Hemiptera, the true bugs, really high efficiencies. All other insects, very high efficiencies as well. This is why insects are we don't like to think of it, they would actually represent a very efficient food source for us because so much of the energy that they're consuming goes directly into their biomass, okay? Much more so than when we eat, cow meat, for example. Now, look at mollusks, about 22%, crustaceans generally about 25%, so crabs, shrimps, lobsters, crayfishes, those kinds of things. All other non-insect invertebrates, about 28%. And then here we have a breakdown of those non-insect invertebrates in terms of herbivores and carnivores. So what you see is that vertebrates, mammals in particular, are amongst the least efficient in terms of production efficiency of animals on the planet, of secondary consumers on the planet. All right. So now let's kind of take this information or this that we talked about here and sort of roll it into a discussion of food chains to ultimately see what happens to the energy that comes into a food chain through the autotrophs and then into the heterotrophs, from primary production to secondary production and so on. So we've talked about food chains already. They describe the series of steps through which the energy that's stored in autotrophs is ultimately passed up the ecosystem through the other trophic levels, right? The feeding relationships are defined by trophic or consumer levels, as we've talked about. Okay, so within a food chain, all of the organisms that get their energy in the same number of steps from the autotrophs or the primary producers are members of the same trophic level. So we generally break these food chains down into various levels. The first level, okay, are generally referred to as the primary producers. Okay, primary producers. The second level, these are often called the primary consumers, okay? Primary consumers. We think of them generally as herbivores, all right? They're heterotrophs, by the way. These guys are the autotrophs, as we've talked about, right? They're making generally food from sunlight, energy of sunlight. And then we have higher levels above the primary consumers. We can call them secondary consumers. Okay, these generally, sometimes they can be herbivores, but typically we tend to think of them as the carnivores. Right, carnivores. Okay, we also have omnivores, don't forget. And omnivores are those organisms that don't feed exclusively on meat or exclusively on plant material. They can feed on both. And so because they can feed on both, they can actually occupy at various times the primary consumer and the secondary consumer levels. They can occupy more than one trophic level as a result of their feeding habits. Okay, so we have major feeding groups then that are based on a common energy source, okay? So the autotrophs here, the herbivores, and the carnivores, those are major feeding groups. These on the left, producers, consumers, and so on, those are trophic levels. So trophic levels here, major feeding groups that result from that, okay? And each of these feeding groups is linked to other feeding groups in a way that represents energy flow, right? Okay, energy flows from autotrophs to herbivores and from herbivores to carnivores. Okay, now when we think about, or when we talk about food chains very generally, every food chain can be lumped into one of two categories. Either it's a grazing food chain, all right, where the source of energy for the herbivores is living plant biomass. In other words, net primary production is the energy source for the grazing food chain. Or we have a detrital food chain, okay, where the source of energy for the decomposers is dead organic matter, what we call detritus. So what kinds of organisms do you find here? Well, things like, common things like snails, millipedes, earthworms are a great example of this, but also fungi, bacteria, that kind of thing. The fungi that grow on leftover bread or stale bread, they are detritivores, okay, decomposers that are breaking down that food that you didn't eat. All right, so let's take a look. Here we have our two different types of food chains. So we have a grazing food chain on the left, detrital food chain on the right. So let's look at the grazing food chain first. We have our primary producers. So these are the autotrophs, right? Plants, obviously. The energy that they assimilate, some of it anyway, goes into the herbivore level as the herbivores feed on the primary producers. Herbivores are then fed on by carnivores, and the energy goes that way. Now notice that each step of the way we have some energy being lost through respiration. Okay, this is energy that goes off ultimately as heat to the environment. All right, now look at our detrital food chain. We have basically plant material that's decaying, was never consumed by an herbivore, that becomes detritus, and then decomposer herbivores break that down, right? And then those are fed upon by other kinds of carnivores. So think about, for example, a vole or a shrew feeding on an earthworm, right? The earthworm may have fed on detritus that was from plant material. The vole or the shrew then fed on the decomposer earthworm. But again, every step of the way, we have some energy being lost through respiration, all right? Now, also, so these orange arrows then that you see here, okay, they're linking the trophic levels, and they represent the flow of energy associated with ingestion. So herbivores are ingesting plant biomass. Carnivores are ingesting herbivore biomass, and so on. The blue arrows, again, as I've said, represent a loss of energy through respiration, okay, ultimately as heat. The brown arrows that we see here represent a combination of dead organic matter, in other words, unconsumed biomass, and waste products, okay, feces and urine. So here we have dead organic matter, plant biomass that wasn't consumed, going in as detritus and into the detrital food chain that way. Herbivores produce, cow pies, for example, or other feces, right? That goes in as organic matter, as detritus, gets funneled through that way. Carnivore feces, for example, go in that way. But also, when an herbivore dies, its tissues end up going in as detritus. Same is true with carnivore dead tissue, right? Decomposition, in other words, of dead bodies and things puts energy or inserts energy into the detrital food chain and gets processed that way. All right. So these are our two types of food chains then, okay? Now, these two food chains are linked. We've seen that, right? The source of energy for the detrital food chain is the grazing food chain's dead organic material and waste. So these arrows here coming off the carnivores, herbivores, and primary producers, that represents the energy input into the detrital food chain, right? That's the source of energy for this entire food chain, is the waste and dead organic matter from the grazing food chain. All right. Energy flow is unidirectional, however, in the grazing food chain, right? You just see that it goes from one level to the next, and then or goes from the food chain into the detrital food chain as detritus, as we've said. But energy flow in the detrital food chain is not unidirectional. Dead organic material and waste from each level return as inputs to the base of the food chain. So we have detritus being consumed by an earthworm, for example. That earthworm produces feces, waste products, which then goes right back into the soil and is then sort of fed upon again. Okay, so it gets sort of recycled because there's energy in those feces, right? And so it can be cycled back into the system, and you have this sort of loop. Now, eventually, that energy comes off as heat of respiration, right? It's not as if the energy in earthworm wastes stays there forever. It's being, whittled away as it cycles through this detrital food chain over and over again. All right. So at higher levels, carnivores from both food chains feed on herbivores from both food chains. You see that here with these orange arrows, right? Carnivores can feed on herbivores from the detrital food chain, and carnivores in the detrital food chain can feed on herbivores in the grazing food chain as well. So these two food chains are highly connected. All right, so the quantity of energy flowing into a trophic level is always going to decrease with each successive trophic level in the food chain, okay? So why does this happen? That's an important question. Also, it's important to understand or to be able to measure, let's say, or estimate how much energy stored as biomass in a trophic level is ultimately converted to biomass in the next higher trophic level. Production efficiencies, as we said. And because we have energy, or the amount of available energy, constantly decreasing as we go from one trophic level to the next, it's important to think about what consequences that might have for an ecosystem. All right, so we know that not all energy is used for production. There's sort of a general rule in ecology when we're talking about energy transformations flow rather, from one trophic level to the next. And that general ecological rule of thumb is that 10% of the energy stored as biomass in a given trophic level is converted to biomass in the next higher trophic level. About 10%. All right, and this generally applies across the board. Okay, there are some exceptions to this, but for the most part, this seems to hold true. That means that if herbivores eat 1,000 kilocalories of plant energy, about 100 kilocalories would be converted into herbivore tissue. Right, that's about 10%. Now, of that 100 kilocalories that's converted into herbivore tissue, about 10 kilocalories then would be converted to first level carnivore tissue, the carnivores feeding on those herbivores. And then, if we have a secondary level of carnivores, like a top predator, let's say, about 1 kilocalorie would be converted to second level carnivore tissue. So at each level, we have about 10% being converted to biomass in the next higher level. That's that general ecological rule. Okay, so based on that, we can then talk about, sorry guys, hold on. From current. Okay. All right, so based on that, we can then talk about what's called trophic efficiency. Okay, trophic efficiency, or TE as it's called. Trophic efficiency measures the transfer to energy between trophic levels. Okay, it's the ratio of the productivity in a given trophic level to the productivity of the trophic level its organisms feed on. So the productivity in a given trophic level is denoted as P sub n. All right, so trophic efficiency then, let me just do this, equals the ratio of productivity in a given trophic level, that's P sub n right there, to the productivity of the trophic level its organisms feed upon, okay? And that is P sub n minus 1. So, as an example here, right, if we say that herbivores convert, let's say, 100 kilocalories of energy to biomass, that's secondary production, by eating 1,000 kilocalories of primary production, then the trophic efficiency in this case is going to equal 100 kilocalories divided by 1,000 kilocalories, and that equals 0.1, okay, or 10%, as we said, right? Okay, that's what trophic efficiency is. It's just a measure then of how much energy that's flowing from one trophic level to the next ends up as biomass in the next trophic level. All right, so another meta-analysis that looked at energy transfer efficiency from 48 different studies of aquatic ecosystems in this case does show some variation, but the mean value turned out to be very close to this 10%, turned out to be about 10.13%, okay? And that's close to that general rule of thumb that we talked about. And this figure here shows that. So here we have various transfer efficiencies. Some were as low as, 1 or 2%, others as high as 24%. But when you plot them all together and you get the frequency distribution, the average turns out to be about 10.13%. Most studies found transfer efficiencies around 10%, maybe a little bit less, a little bit more, some extreme examples, but they were very rare for the most part. So that 10% rule of thumb seems to generally hold true. All right, so an important consequence then of this decreasing energy transfer from one trophic level to the next is the decrease in standing biomass of organisms within each successive level. Have you ever watched the nature programs where they're looking at the African Serengeti and ever wondered why there can be millions of wildebeest, for example, but maybe only a few hundred lions or something like that, or a few thousand lions at most. It's because of transfer efficiency. So the biomass in one trophic level, or each trophic level, then can be shown as sort of a pyramid, okay? Each level in this energy pyramid we're going to look at indicates the total amount of standing crop biomass present in that particular level at any given moment. And what we're doing is comparing the standing crop biomass from one trophic level to the next. In most of these pyramids, the base is the largest level, and the levels become more narrow as we move up. All right. In general, the biomass of producers is going to have to be greater than that of herbivores, and that makes perfect sense, right? Because if you have a loss of energy, if you have a transfer efficiency of less than 100%, which you always do as you go from one trophic level to the next, then the lower trophic level has to have more energy than the next higher trophic level, because some of that energy is going to be lost through respiration as heat and whatnot. So the biomass of producers has to be that or greater than that of the herbivores, and the biomass of herbivores has to be greater than that of the carnivores. And that's what we see here. So this is from a Florida bog, so just think wetland, right? So we have our primary producers, okay, and this is going to be like 809 grams per meter square. That's, again, standing crop biomass. It's not a rate because there's no time factor there. This is just standing crop biomass at any given moment. But you see how much there is in plant material, right? Then primary consumers, 37 grams per meter square. Secondary consumers, maybe 11. Tertiary consumers, those that feed on secondary consumers, 1.5. So the reason that we have this basic structure here, this pyramid structure, is because transfer efficiencies from one level to the next are quite low. This is also why in any given trophic system, the trophic levels in any given ecosystem, you're only going to have maybe 3 or 4 at most, because there's not enough energy in the tertiary consumer level to support another level on top of it, because the transfer efficiencies are too low. All right, now this is the general pattern that we see in terrestrial systems, okay? And for the most part in aquatic systems as well, with some exceptions. This situation, this pattern, this pyramid pattern, can be reversed in some cases. In aquatic ecosystems, for example, you can have the biomass of phytoplankton, which are very, very small and very short-lived. At any given moment, the standing crop biomass of phytoplankton can be less than the standing crop biomass of the longer-lived, larger herbivorous zooplankton. So at any given moment, you take a water sample from a lake, it could be the case that there's more biomass in zooplankton than there is in the phytoplankton. And that would seem to be backwards compared to what we see here. And it is backwards. But the reason why you often get that is because the phytoplankton, because they're so short-lived, they reproduce very rapidly, right? So their rate of production is still extremely high, much higher than what you see in the zooplankton, but the zooplankton live longer and therefore reproduce more slowly, and so you don't see as high of a turnover. The very, very high turnover you see in phytoplankton sort of compensates for the fact that they have very low standing crop biomass at any given moment. They're constantly being produced, so there's constantly new food being produced for the zooplankton. All right, that makes sense. And that's what you see right here. So again, in this case, this is reversed. In the phytoplankton, we have very low standing crop biomass, but because they're producing new generations, daily, in some cases on an hourly basis, you're getting a lot of energy funneled in. There's more energy here in terms of, or more energy, I should say, is being assimilated as a rate any given moment than there is being assimilated through secondary production here in the consumer level, because there's such high turnover of these phytoplankton cells, all right? And that's for the English Channel as an example, okay? All right, so that's the end then of Chapter 20. That's our last video lecture for the semester.